I want to see it in car parts. I want to see it in solar panels. Being able to drive down the road and seeing it growing like I saw it in Canada back in 2013 would just be phenomenal.
Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. Today we're coming to you from Lexington, Kentucky, the heart of hemp country, to hear from Annie Rouse. In our Women of Weed series, Annie is a standout historian with a natural bent towards hemp. As you'll hear, she knew Woody Harrelson when he was planting hemp seeds to get himself arrested. She studied the history of cannabis through college, and then went to Canada on a Fulbright scholarship to research hemp. In addition to those stories, we'll go on a lengthy dive into the history as we learn more about her newest project called Anslinger, the Untold Cannabis Conspiracy. It's a podcast series where she dug into the archives around the country and sat down with many experts to assemble a fascinating look at the early American history with that old devil's weed. She's an authority in many directions and an engaging person to talk to, so I hope you enjoy this interview with Annie Rouse from the heartland of hemp. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. I'm very pleased to be here in Lexington, Kentucky with Annie Rouse. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And so you know a lot about the history of hemp, and now you work in the industry as well. How did your interest first get started?
Well, it first got started because of my dad, and we're actually in his production studio today, so it comes all full circle. But he was really involved in the hemp movement in Kentucky back in the early 90s with Joe Hickey and Andy Graves and Woody Harrelson, David Spaulding, Craig Lee. They all got Woody Harrelson on board to plant 4 infamous hemp seeds in Kentucky, and then proceeded to have him become arrested so that he could eventually take it to the Supreme Court and get them to distinguish between hemp and marijuana. So my dad was there every step of the way recording everything, and now you can actually see a lot of that footage within the documentary Hempsters, Plant the Seed. So when they're actually arresting Woody Harrelson, my dad's you can see him in the reflection in the cop car window. So I was 8 years old when that was all happening, and I just thought it was like the coolest thing that I've ever experienced. And it's like, wow, Woody Harrelson is getting arrested for planting a plant. Like, I just don't understand, but he's like this really cool famous guy, and my dad's hanging out with him. So that was really what initially sparked my passion, I guess, for hemp. And because my dad was a part of that and he was just a part of this movement in the early 90s, it had always kind of been a part of my life. And so several years later, when I was in college, I had to write this paper, didn't really know what to write about. And my mom and my dad were both like, why don't you write about hemp? I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I could do that. So I went to the library, started digging through all these books, and then everything just kind of unfolded in front of me. Like, why is this illegal? That it was Kentucky's major cash crop. It has all these environmental benefits. And at the time, I was getting really into environmental policy, and I just got really mad about it all. And so I wrote the paper, and then simultaneously I was in this environmental economics class, and my professor was really into hemp as well. And so we would converse about it, and then it all just kind of came together at once, So I ended up, that professor convinced me to go and study environmental policy for graduate school, and so I did. And when I was out there, my whole thesis was to change the policy on hemp. Every paper that I had was geared towards that. I got into the program, and all my friends were like, oh, it's the hemp girl, The people are like, teachers are like, what do you want to do in 5 years? And I'm like, well, I will have expected to legalize hemp. And they're like, what? Who is this person? And yeah, so then when I was there, I did another paper which actually was a research proposal for a Fulbright scholarship, and ended up submitting that to the Fulbright program and got accepted. So I moved to Canada in 2013 before the Farm Bill passed, and was funded by the Department of State to study technically and federally controlled narcotic in Canada. So yeah, I went up there and studied the environmental life cycle of hemp in initially it was to study the automotive components using the fibers within interior paneling, but the automotive industry was way too tight on the data that I needed to actually do the study. So I had to switch to the building industry. So I studied a hempcrete, biofiber hempcrete block, and then compared that to a hempcrete, like a standard form-fitting hempcrete wall that we know of mostly today, and then compared that to a cinder block, and took it from the raw material to the finished product, and mostly looked at the carbon footprint of those three different walls.
And these are two fascinating products that I think I don't know how get made, really. How does it go to make a hemp plastic interior for a car or hempcrete? How does that process work?
So with automotive components, you have the bast fiber. You decorticate the bast fiber. It's usually the bast fiber that's used because it's a lot stronger than the hurd or the short fibers. And so you use that for the automotive components. So you decorticate it, and then you usually fill it with other materials like polyesters or other natural fibers and create a matte material, and then you put that matting into usually an injection molding, and then that creates the form that you would put into a car. For hempcrete, you do the core material, so it's the woody hurd, and you basically mix that with water and hydrated and hydraulic lime, maybe some cement, and you compress it in between removable formwork. So it doesn't have compression strength, but it has high insulation value. So you have to build a timber frame for structural integrity, and then you basically compress that hempcrete around the timber frame.
So it's put into place around the timber. It'd be poured on site almost like a concrete.
Yeah, it could be. It needs to be. Right now, it's mostly like we did one just up the street from here earlier, I guess last Hemp History Week, 2017, and we built a hempcrete house. And you see them in a lot of different areas of the U.S. now, and it's mostly volunteers that are doing it. The consistency is rough because people are normally like coming to the site that day, learning how to do it, and then doing it. And so there's, people have different strengths and physically and mentally, but, because of you're like compressing it physically into the wall, the consistency is off. So the industry for hempcrete, especially if we want it to really succeed in like major construction, the system needs to be changed either with like a blowing agent, kind of like a foam sprayer might be, but for hempcrete, or in Europe right now they do a panel system. So they're actually making the hempcrete off-site with machines, and then they just bring the panels to the site and basically screw them into the timber framing or steel framing, whatever it might be.
And what would you see be most helpful to the rollout of this hempcrete technology in this country?
We need scale for sure, but the biggest thing that we need is building codes. Construction companies to get on board with it, but building codes to be able to go to the site and say, okay, we know what this is. It reaches our standards, and yes, it has this insulation value, and we know what it is. Right now, like with the house just up the street from here, it took forever to get the building permits to get it because the building inspectors, they have a sheet that they look off of and they can just check things off. They don't know what hempcrete is. They're where's the moisture layer, and it's like, well, it doesn't need one. So what do you mean it doesn't need one? Like there's no like solid data that shows one way or another. Same with like the thermal insulation value of it. We have an idea of what it is, but we don't know the way that the energy moves, thermal mass and moisture moves between the walls. So that's actually something that Friends of Hemp, a nonprofit, is working on, that I'm the president of, and we actually received some funding from a local construction company here in Kentucky. So we're going to be putting meters into the walls of the house, so we can actually measure that thermal mass and moisture and get real data that can hopefully be used down the road.
And so where did you go after your Canadian study?
So after I finished the Fulbright, the Farm Bill had passed. So I moved back to Kentucky. I had one more semester of grad school, so I did a little back and forth. And then, came back here. Was actually really sick of the industry. When I did my last semester of grad school, I had gotten some different advice, and they were like, well, don't put yourself in a box. So I was like, I'm done with this hemp thing. Like, people keep telling me that I'm this hemp girl and, that hempy girl over there. I'm like, I don't want to just be the hempy girl. I'm more than that, So I actually started applying for other jobs and got pretty far with a couple different positions and was in the middle of interviews and actually went to Indiana, Purdue Hemp Field Day, and I was just like, man, no one knows anything about this plant. Like, I know more than 99% of the people here, except maybe Dr. Paul Malberg over there, who studied it for decades. I should probably stick with it. So I decided that I would stay in Lexington and I would figure out where I wanted to go. So it took me a while to actually figure out exactly what I wanted to do, about up until last year, really. So I started Friends of Hemp, the nonprofit, and then I did some consulting and brokering of hemp products under Think Hempy Thoughts, my blog, and then I had actually, for the past, I guess really since 2009, I had been secretively working on this project about Harry Anslinger, where I had been going to all of these different archives and looking through these documents and trying to figure out the story behind him, really, and why he did this whole reefer madness. So I had finally written a script, actually, back in 2015, and had pitched that to a Hollywood producer and realized that I needed to gain traction and really needed to protect my story because the script wasn't enough. And so decided that I would start this podcast, and simultaneously with the podcast and with creating, really solidifying what I wanted to do in the industry in terms of creating a marketplace for CBD that has the best quality CBD and a lot of other things that I can't explain right now, but will be coming in the future. Kind of all of these things combined together, and I said, all right, these are the two things that I really need to do in the industry. I have to make this podcast that features everything that I've been researching for the past 10 years almost, and I need to create Anavii Market, which we just launched. I launched both of them actually earlier this year.
Congratulations.
Thanks. It's challenging.
It's good. Yeah. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be worth it.
Yeah, that's true.
And I'd like to go back to the history part because I don't think people know enough about Harry Anslinger and how much of this springs from one man's determination. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and how he came to power and who he was? Yeah,
so Harry Anslinger, most people don't have any idea who he is. He was chief of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 to 1962. He is responsible for basically every drug enforcement policy that exists today, or drug enforcement strategy, I should say. He didn't actually create the policies, he just enforced them. So he was really, most people think if they know him, they think of him as, the man who demonized hemp as marijuana. And yeah, he was partially responsible for that. There were a lot of other factors that played into it, but he really actually didn't care. He didn't want anything to do with cannabis early on in his career. And then later on, he flips a switch. And I'm not going to tell you why, because you got to tune into my podcast, season 2. Well, no, actually season 2 will shine a little bit of light on it, but season 3 will really tell the story of why he flipped the switch. It has nothing to do with anything that anybody ever would have imagined. Actually, most people think, it's related to the DuPonts and to William Randolph Hearst, and no, not at all. I'm sure that they played a little bit of a role, and I know William Randolph Hearst did, in terms of a lot of the journalists that Hearst hired worked with Harry Anslinger. They were considered part of his quote-unquote army of allies, which he really used to fire up the public and to get public support mostly for heroin was his biggest concern for enforcing these heroin addiction, but also later on for marijuana, quote-unquote marijuana or cannabis, to gain the public support, because he thought that the reason that Prohibition failed, the biggest reason, was because it lost the public support. So he was a fascinating character, and I've gone into all these archives within his archives. I went up to Penn State University, where a major, the biggest bulk of his archives are up there, and spent a couple days up there just rifling through everything and just super nerding out over it all.
That's where the real researchers are.
Yeah,
because he was actually, like me, he was from Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
And the other famous Pennsylvanian is James Buchanan, who was the worst president in U.S. history. And so it's my damned Keystone State that seems to screw things up.
Right. Well, he actually, so Anslinger, while he created a lot of very bad enforcement strategies that have resulted in horrendous corporate prisons today and things like that. A lot of what he did was he was a patriot, first of all, and a lot of what he did was always in light of the country. He was super intelligent. He was fluent in 4 languages, maybe 6. He was a really skilled negotiator, and that is actually why he was given the job. Initially, they had someone else in mind, and they didn't want to put Anslinger into the role. But because he had shown with his work with Prohibition, he was doing a lot of work in the Bahamas with Prohibition, and then he ended up doing, because he was a diplomat, and then he was second in command of Prohibition, and convinced England, Great Britain, United Kingdom, whatever it was called back then, to get on board with enforcing alcohol prohibition more in the Bahamas, which was owned by them at the time, and there was a lot of alcohol escaping from the Bahamas to the U.S., and so he actually was put in charge of convincing Great Britain to put these enforcement strategies in place to reduce that trafficking into the U.S. And because of that, and a lot of his past with other work as a diplomat, they thought, well, let's give him a try, because we know that narcotic regulation is a major international issue, and we need someone that has international clout.
And do I remember, wasn't there a corruption charge of someone higher than him that helped him get the job as well?
Not that I know of. There was, the story is that Andrew Mellon, that Harry Anslinger married Martha Denniston, and Martha Denniston was Andrew Mellon's niece, and Andrew Mellon was secretary-treasurer at the time, and that's why he got the job. But Martha Denniston and Andrew Mellon are not related, and he almost didn't get the job. He had to be, strong-armed. People had to convince Secretary Mellon to give him the job, and President Hoover at the time to allow Anslinger to have the job. So, misinformation.
There's a lot of it. And with the FBN, it was under the Department of Treasury at that point?
So at the time, there was the Department of Treasury. It was considered a tax. So the Marijuana Tax Act, the Harrison Act, which initially started in 1914, regulated opium, mostly opium, cocaine, and then later on they basically took the Marijuana Tax Act and the similar language of the Harrison Act, they put it into the Marijuana Tax Act, but had it be for cannabis, actually marijuana. And so there's a really weird language shift that happens between calling cannabis hemp, Indian hemp, cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, marijuana. It's very bizarre. Episode 6 of my podcast, Anslinger, the Untold Cannabis Conspiracy, really dives into that and shines a light on what the League of Nations thought of it, the medicinal properties that they knew back then. Pretty remarkable, considering that they say that there's no medicinal value today. It's like, well, people back then were going along the sides of the road banks and rivers and collecting hemp and sending it to pharmaceutical companies, selling it to pharmaceutical companies, and they were using it to soothe restlessness and for insomnia and things like that. So I pretty sure there's medical value there, guys.
Yeah, there were hundreds of pharmaceutical formulations at that point being sold. Because I believe one of the things about the Tax Act was how it was slipped in under the radar. A lot of the important industries didn't realize that this marijuana thing they were talking about was actually the hemp seeds they were using for bird food or for paint thinner or things like that. And the parties that should have known often didn't, and that using a tax act like this was such a big reach of federal power at that time in history. There were very little things the federal government would do across state lines, but I think it was that Machine Gun Firearms Act that kind of opened the door of like, okay, we can regulate machine guns across state lines. And right after that passed, he saw the openings like, okay, we're going to do the same thing. It's just going to be a tax act for marijuana, and we're never going to give a tax stamp for it. So we'll just, which is a really fiendishly smart way of prohibiting something.
Yeah, definitely. It all had a purpose, and again, I'm not going to say the purpose because spoiler alert. But it was a sneaky maneuver that probably may have saved the world, actually. That's all I can say.
All right. Well, now you do have me intrigued. 'Cause I read a lot about him, and I do not know where you're coming from, so you got a new listener. But what about the corruption? Because the Prohibition police were notorious for their corruption, and then it seemed like the FBN was as well, especially 90 Church Street in New York. And what was it like to read about that kind of stuff and how prevalent it was?
So I haven't read too much about the corruption aspect of it, but the reason initially that they created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, because technically Anslinger was second in command of Prohibition in the narcotics division, and they decided that when Prohibition ended and when they created this new FBN, they wanted it to be a completely separate organization, and that was because of the corruption. And so they figured that separating it from alcohol prohibition would create less corruption, or at least the idea of less corruption. And that's pretty much all I've really found about the corruption aspect of it. I'm sure that there was a lot of corruption, as there always is, and things like that.
And what about the truth of the racist quotes of his that pass around the internet? You read some really horrible ones, and then perhaps some of them aren't all true.
Right. So he actually was a racist. We know that for sure. You can tell from I think it was a 1934 report. He actually almost got fired for it, but he came out and in a government document and called an informant a quote-unquote nigger. And he almost got fired for it, and so actually that was pretty much the end of him actually stating any sort of remarks himself. A lot of what we find on the internet today is mostly either wrong, or it is quotes that he repeated from newspaper articles or other reports from the other side of the country that something was happening with darkies and whatever the different quotes are. So we know that he was a racist because he said these things, but, a lot of people were very racist back then. But most of what's on the internet was not his direct quotes.
what actually went down with his firing under Kennedy, because I hear all of these different stories of how and why it happened, that he was too much of a dinosaur and got shoved out, or he pissed him off, or I mean, what's your take on why he was finally let go after such a long run, kind of the J. Edgar Hoover of the narcotics world?
I think probably it was just his time. I mean, he was, I think, 70 years old when they kicked him out, essentially. I think Kennedy, maybe he had other motives. Maybe he didn't entirely believe in his strategies. I'm not too sure about any of that. But I think mostly it was just his time. Maybe he was old.
And the last hairy question is something I read about in Chasing the Scream, about how at the end he was using morphine for the pain. He died a pretty horrible death, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. And the irony of the opium plant that he hunted so long, his whole life, was the final thing he was using.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's pretty ironic. Also his wife, Martha Denniston, had really bad, I think she had, I want to say MS, which is also ironic considering that cannabis is helpful for MS and what we know today. So both of the things that he was really hunting could have helped both of them, or were helping him in the case of morphine in his last couple of years. So, he despised heroin. He realized the medicinal value of morphine, and it was more so that he wanted to control the supply side of morphine and its derivatives so that it wouldn't leak into the illicit market. He wholeheartedly believed in the medicinal aspects of it, though. So, well, yes, he hunted it. It wasn't like he was buying it off the street from a drug peddler or anything like that. But it is pretty funny that both him and his wife could have used cannabis really to probably help both of their ailments.
So I guess we should close the door on that one, because I know you can go on for a long time.
I could go on for a really long time.
And where would people find the podcast in your series?
Yeah. So it's on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and thinkhempythoughts.com. Like Think Happy Thoughts, but hempy. And it's called Anslinger, the Untold Cannabis Conspiracy. So I've done the first season, 6 episodes. It's a combination of narration and interviews with experts on the subject at hand. The second season, I'm not positive when it'll launch, but in the next 6 to 8 weeks probably. So it'll be another 6 episodes, and then I'll have probably a 3rd and 4th episode or season as well.
Wow, that's a lot of material.
It is a lot of, yeah. Initially it was a lot more than that, but it just takes way too long to do. And as I'm unfolding the story, I'm kind of hitting on the points that I thought maybe I would do later on, so it works out.
And it's all crafted right here in these studios?
I record it right in this room. So
all right.
Either all the narration I record in this studio, and then pretty much everything is done here.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
I would recommend the series. It is a fascinating time in history, and really where the bones of everything that happened today got laid. Because they shut down the FBN in the early 60s, and then they replaced it with $1 billion DEA program with 5,500 agents, but they were a bunch of schmucks too.
Yeah.
That
transition's interesting because of the entire time that Anslinger was in power, they kept trying to change the FBN from under the Department of Treasury to the Department of Justice, and Anslinger refused to let it happen. And he'd get his army of allies behind him to prevent it from happening, and then finally, after he stepped down, it was like, okay, now we're doing this.
Because he was a consummate bureaucrat. He always came in under budget. He seemed to be able to work well with everybody. His
budget, that was one of his besides controlling the supply side of narcotics, the budget was the next thing, and he always kept a low budget, but he was able to keep a low budget because they were able to use, not acquisitions, but
seized
funds from, drug dealers and things like that. Drug money. They were able to sell morphine during World War II, and they were able to get revenue in other streams, and that's why he was able to keep the low budget.
Yeah. And really fighting the mob. I mean, I'm reading 90 Church Street now, which is a memoir by an inside agent, and it's so well done. He doesn't even mention Anslinger. It's just about the hijinks in New York. And they were so good about fighting the mafia, but they were as dark as they were. I mean, the stories in this book of how they got the job done and how they almost set rats in the cage against each other with their lies. It's an impressive operation, but there's no good guys in it. It's all bad guys. But
I'll have to read it.
Yeah, it's very well done. The author is, I think, not too far from here.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I'd love to sit down with him at some point.
Yeah.
Was there any other books that were really helpful to you for this research?
Oh, yeah, tons. I mean, Containing Addiction has been great. That's the author, Matt Pimbleton. He is actually the first interview of the second season. So I actually met him at the archives of the National Academy of Sciences in D.C., and we just nerded out over Anslinger. So that book and himself have been a huge benefit. I also read this book. Harry Anslinger's book is what really sparked everything besides Emperor Wears No Clothes. But Harry Anslinger's book, The Murderers, it's a really great book. You can find it on Amazon. There's Drug Diplomacy in the 20th Century by Bill McAllister. He will actually be an interviewee for the third season, and he'll actually divulge the information about the Marijuana Tax Act and the reasoning behind that. Really fascinating book. It's pretty heavy just in information, but it gives you a great idea of what was at stake for all these countries when all of these international drug laws were coming into place, which is fascinating to look at in terms of who was looking into pharmaceuticals and Western medicine versus Eastern medicine, and how the supply chain was working with each of these countries, and why China got on board with prohibition, and really fascinating stuff. And there's tons of other books that have been enormously helpful as well, and I'm blanking on them.
And before we move on to the products you're creating, it was a personal medical issue that led you to see some of the medical benefits of cannabis, correct?
Yeah. So when I moved back from Canada, I was really more interested in fiber and grain. I didn't have a great care for CBD. I was pretty skeptical about it. And then I suddenly just started noticing all these really weird issues. I was having, my knee was in horrible pain, and I was getting my hands and fingers were falling asleep all the time, and I was getting these horrible headaches and horrible allergies and sensitivity to light and just all these very bizarre things. I ended up going on the CDC website and found all of my side effects and issues under the category of Lyme's disease, along with a bullseye rash that I had remembered having when I was back in Canada. Actually, in 2013, I had gotten it in Banff National Park and thought it was eczema, didn't think anything of it, and went to the doctor, was diagnosed with Lyme's disease, and so then I realized it was an inflammatory issue. And so I started taking CBD. I was like, well, I may as well try it. I'm working in this industry. And that's when I actually realized, whoa, this is making me feel a lot better. I got to do something about this. And so I started taking that, and then I switched to another brand. It didn't work nearly as well. And then I started kind of asking around a little bit more, figuring out the issues in the industry, realizing that there was a major quality control problem. And so at the time, I had been building this verification really to try and make the industry, the hemp industry itself, develop sustainably, environmentally. And instead, I ended up switching gears, realizing that unfortunately, no one really cares about the environmental aspect. The industry just, the companies need to make money. We got to build the industry itself, sadly. But, I'm sure some companies do still care about the environmental aspect, but not in terms of monetarily. So I ended up switching the verification to focus on the quality control side of CBD, realizing the issues. And so now I've launched Anavii Market, Anavii, which was a word that I made up, meaning an alternative lifestyle. So it's powered by plant-based alternatives that have all been third-party verified. We verify the quality of the CBD, making sure that the products we sell have been tested in the 5 major categories of residual solvents, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, microbiologics, and of course phytocannabinoid spectrum. So we make sure that the brands that we sell, those manufacturers are living up to a standard that we really believe in. And then we ask for other information as well that will eventually be built into this secret product that we'll be releasing later. That was a decision that was really difficult for me to make because I really believed in CBD, but I wanted the sustainability aspect to be very prevalent in the industry. But it was kind of something that I realized I'm just gonna have to put on hold for a little bit, and then but I'll be eventually, as the industry develops and my company grows, we'll be implementing the sustainability aspect back into the verification and into the products that we sell, so that consumers can not only get on and find the best products, but they can also find products that they care about in terms of their conscious decisions. Maybe it's the location where it's grown, or maybe it's a carbon footprint or something of the like.
What would be your ideal to see in the sustainability pipeline of what you could offer to people?
Ideally, I'd like to be able to have a platform where people can see this company, it's this carbon footprint, it's this water footprint. They have, they do these things to try and reduce their impact. They use recycled material. The cannabis industry in general, particularly the marijuana side of the cannabis industry, has an enormous waste stream that's coming out of nowhere. You walk down the beaches in California and you see a ton of plastic pollution, and now we're seeing this new waste stream of those little plastic pop things, that marijuana comes in. And it's really sad to see, because it was an industry that 20 years ago was a bunch of hippies trying to fight for it, and having a lot of them having a strong feeling towards the environment. And the reason that I got into hemp was because of a few reasons, but one was because of the environmental aspect of it, and the idea of using natural products and natural materials. And I would love to see the marijuana industry to start using hemp bioplastics for those, pop top containers. That would be wonderful to see. That would be great.
What are the technical aspects limiting that? Because it's something that a lot of people who've read The Hemper a lot of times talk about constantly, but I don't think it's understood how tough that technical problem still is.
Mm-hmm. It's mostly a cost thing. You get polypropylene pellets from China that are $1 a pound. We can't compete with that. Not even like corn and soy can compete with that. You got to make something that's maybe 10% more than that in order for bioplastics in general to really succeed, or some sort of a policy shift that makes it happen. And the policy shift's definitely not going to happen. So it's got to be in the economies of scale. And it's possible now to use hemp as a filler, filler within these polymers, and there's a market for that right now. But it's going to take a while in order for it to be a market, in order, like 100% hemp bioplastic. We can't use the oil. The oil's way too valuable. That's typically what you would use in order to make bioplastics. But the oil is too valuable in terms, like the cold pressed oil, not CBD, but cold pressed oil is too valuable as a health food, and it also just is really energy intensive actually to create the long molecular chains that you need in order to create plastics. Petroleum is already that way, but plant materials, you have to put in a lot of energy in order to make them that way, and then you got to make the plastic. So unless there's some major technological breakthrough, it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But the fibers, those can be used as fillers today easily.
And as someone who pays so much attention to hemp, of all of the thousands of uses out there, what are the ones that are most exciting for you that you'll think will be growing soon?
Well, CBD, cannabinoids, I shouldn't even call it CBD. I mean, CBD is kind of like old news now. But the other cannabinoids, I mean, there's so much research that needs to be done with the endocannabinoid system and the way that these cannabinoids are interacting with our bodies. I was interviewing a scientist the other day, and he was like, oh, well, we think that most of the scientific community actually thinks that CBD doesn't even act on the endocannabinoid system and the CB1 and CB2 receptors. It's actually acting on the serotonin and adenosine receptors. And it's like, what? That's crazy. Like, to think that we know so little about it. So I think in the future, there's just going to be so many products that come out that are so beneficial for people on different levels, both at the pharmaceutical and supplemental food standpoint. And that'll be huge for healthcare. And other than that, I mean, there's like so many different things that could happen. I just want to see it in everything. I want to see it in car parts. I want to see it in solar panels. That the semiconductor market, and that's huge. That could be great. Being able to drive down the road and seeing it growing like I saw it in Canada back in 2013 would just be phenomenal. And I'm sure there's so many products out there that haven't even scratched the surface yet that are going to be a breakthrough for our world. So it's exciting. I'm glad I stuck with it.
Amen. Me too. So the last question I wanted to end with was, if we could snag you another Fulbright scholarship so you could disappear for a couple years and just research, where would you spend your time? What would you be studying?
I would love to have funding to actually support the research that I've been doing on Anslinger. I've been doing everything just out of my own pocket and out of my own passion behind it. So if I could get another Fulbright scholarship to study just that and be able to present that to the public, I mean, that would be ideal. But in another life, I would probably go back to school. I would study chemistry, and I would study the endocannabinoid system and figure out the physiological aspect of it all. I think it's just so fascinating, but I understand enough about it because I have been around it for long enough, but I don't really have like a science background, so probably have to go back and learn all that before I really dove in at the forefront of it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for all the study that you've done and for how much you're sharing it with the world. It's really appreciated. Thank you.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate what you guys are doing, too.
Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.